I'm Seán Rocks. I present Arena on RTE Radio 1, normally at this time of the night. So I presume you're recording it and listening to it back when you go home or whatever. Casey, he's standing in for me this evening. But I'm delighted to be here for the 10th annual Dublin Book Festival. We've been associated with the festival now for 3 or 4 years and delighted to be part of it again this evening, and as we were last night as well. What a treat we have in store for you this evening. An award-winning director gives an insider's view of the machinations of the film industry and the ongoing battle, it would seem, between money and art. He chooses to do so in a work of fiction called Crime of Passion. And a former member of the Irish Defence Forces and now much respected security analyst, gives us an insider's view of one of the greatest acts of bravery by a small group of Irish UN troops in the Congo in 1961, but also one of the best kept secrets of the activities of that particular group of soldiers as well. And while he chooses to tell us this story in a work of non-fiction called Siege of JADOTVILLE, some of the deeds described would fit quite nicely into any work of fiction that you might read. So to help us tease out how fact and fiction are perhaps unsurprisingly quite alike sometimes, we have these two gentlemen, but I want them to do something else for me as well. I think it's more surprising, I'm hoping to find out, how making a film and making war are actually a lot more alike than we might actually think. So please welcome John Boorman and Declan Power. It's all your fault, John, that I want to find out about making war and making films and how they're alike, because you start you start at the very beginning of the Crime of Passion with Agamemnon arriving home from the war in Troy.
Yes, that's right.
Why is he there, and what has war got to do with filmmaking?
Well, it's often been said that film is war, and I think it does approximate it to some extent. Certainly the feeling of being in the trenches, because, every film is... I was talking to Tony Curtis, and he just made a film, and I said, how was the picture? He said, miraculous. I said, really? As good as that? He said, any film that gets made is miraculous. And there's so many reasons why a film should not be made. And the films cost a lot of money, and there used to be in old Hollywood this saying, I'm talking about back in the 20s and 30s, they used to say, there's nothing as scared as $1 million. And now, of course, they say probably there's nothing as scared as $100 million. And because I wrote a book about the making of a film, The Emerald Forest, called Money into Light. And that was because when you make a film, you take all the paraphernalia of life, the technology, equipment, people, sets, costumes, and you turn them into light. And all you have, at the end of the day, and you spent all that money, all you have is a light flickering on a wall. And then you have the desperate task of trying to turn it back into money. So, in between you wage war to get it made.
I wonder, Declan, if you had ever thought of the making of war in any way related to the making of a film. One of the things that John said there, he talked about the bringing together of people, paraphernalia, equipment. He said costumes. I presume we could put uniforms in place of costumes there. We don't end up with a light flickering on a wall, however, at the end of it.
No, but I think you're right. There are definite similarities in terms of the mobilisation and organisation and coordination of a large body of people and material. There's a lot of logistics, there's a lot of planning, a lot of coordination. a lot of man management that goes into it, and you're usually doing it, as far as I can ascertain, in places that are not always that comfortable either. Probably the added difficulty for making a film might be having to manage certain types of egos. The military don't quite have to
The military don't have egos.
Oh, they do, but it manifests itself in a different way. They usually, you don't have a problem generally getting people out of their dressing rooms to man their positions, shall we put it that way. But I think, it's not unusual, I think, that an awful lot of people from military backgrounds, and I think John might agree, in the post-war era, ended up going into the filmmaking business. Be it even as actors, but certainly as producers, because a huge amount of that is about logistics and admin. Our own Emmett Dalton, for those of you that are history buffs, might remember that he initially started his career as a young lieutenant in the Irish Guards in the battlefields of World War I, where he won the Military Cross, and then in the IRA, and then as a general in the Free State Army, and then went on to become a leading light in the nascent film industry in Ireland. And I don't think there was, I think there's a correlation there. I think he understood how to coordinate assets and people towards a particular objective, and that's where filmmaking and the military coalesce in that regard.
Let's talk a little bit, just for those who maybe aren't familiar with...
Can I just say one thing in relation to that? Because my last film, Queen and Country, was about my time as a conscript in the army in the 50s. And I can say that certainly being in the army is not nearly as tough as making a film. and I, as a child, I was in the war at the Blitz in London, and that was not nearly as scary as making a movie.
I think all joking aside, if you're the director, where you've got the creative responsibility, as well as the overall management and logistical responsibility. And nobody, making every film, I would imagine, is different. It's like writing a book. There's no ideal formula to follow. So there's a lot of scary responsibility. Whereas even if you are going into a theatre of operations, and depending on what your rank is, basically your job is to turn up when you're told and do what you're told and get on with it. And even if you're in a position of authority where you're giving orders, there's usually, for anybody that may have military service there's a format in which you follow. You are going from here, through there, to there. You will do the following, and you will do it by a certain time.
Hit your mark.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you don't, I don't know, do you have the same level of, there is a difference, obviously. Nobody should be getting killed in the making of a film. But I think there's a lot of scary creative responsibility, and it tends to fall onto one man or woman's shoulders, and that's the director.
Let us lay out, I'm just anxious for those who maybe aren't aware of the two books that we're talking about, for starter. John's novel, Crime of Passion, and Declan's work of non-fiction, Siege at JADOTVILLE. First of all, John, the story that you're telling in Crime of Passion, and the man who has the responsibility that Declan was speaking about there, a man called Daniel Shaw. We meet him in Cannes and at a screening of his film. Within 4 pages, he's kind of ready to make another film because he has to. Explain that aspect of the story, sir, because it sort of sets the whole plot in train.
Yes, well, he and his producer and indeed writer, they've made this film is showing in Cannes, and they've also made one or two other well-regarded films, but none of them have made any money. And they realised that unless they make a hit, they're going to be out of the business. And this is how it works, because you don't have to make a hit on every picture, but you have to make one now and again. And otherwise, you won't get another picture made. And that's always the fear of the film director, is that he won't be allowed to make another movie. So they sit down and they plot out how to make a hit movie. And they plan it coldly and as sufficiently as they can to do that. And it's a story of how that film develops, changes and alters. Because a movie, once it gets going, once it gathers momentum and it alters and changes, if every element enters, casting, the weather, the zeitgeist, all the things that make up a movie take hold. And you as a director, you start by dragging everybody along and trying to communicate your vision. And it gets to a point where everybody kind of gets it. And then it takes off. And you then are on a roller coaster, really trying to keep it straight and not to let it go off the rails. And you never know quite how it's going to turn out. And this is not a bad thing. It's something you're well advised to go along with it and let it go, take you where it will. And rather than try to drag it back to your original vision, go along with it and let's see where it goes. And then you only really discover the film when you're in the cutting room and you're editing it, and then the film emerges. And it's often quite surprising. You say, well, I didn't know it was about that.
You know, it's really begun to strike me now, as I listen to John giving us that explanation of the plot of the novel. There are so few words that you would have to change in that telling of a film being made. You think it's about one thing, then perhaps you have to do a little bit of a diversionary tactic to get the one that you really want made. These are military manoeuvres that he's talking about, really. The siege at JADOTVILLE, set in context for us, let's not get into the Congo just for the time, and I'll ask you to do that later on, but these men, where they were and why they found themselves in, a film that nobody would want to be part of. And I'm not talking about the film that was made of the book, in a situation that nobody would want to be part of.
Yeah. It sounds like a movie but the cameras weren't present.
Yeah, they weren't.
I know what you mean, yeah. And some people have said that to me, overseas have commented that, did it really happen along those lines? Now, obviously, some things were dramatised a bit, but to answer Seán's question, essentially the troops were deployed to JADOTVILLE to protect the townspeople of JADOTVILLE. That was their military objective. It wasn't about the standard military objective of holding ground because it was strategically important. And that's an important point to remember, because obviously they were cut off and surrounded. Nobody had really put in place a plan to be able to support them logistically or militarily. There wasn't a whole lot of thought put into it. And I suppose, again, just to give a little bit of context, they were largely sort of conned into it. The UN were being conned by a much cleverer adversary, the Katangan regime, and their backers, the wealthy backers in the mining industry. And one of the things they were saying was, you want to disarm our mercenary-led forces. Well, if you do, and various different tribes go on the rampage, there will be blood in your hands. So that was the context. So then when pressure was being put, why aren't there troops at JADOTVILLE? They sent a contingent, a Swedish-Irish contingent, who reported back that we really shouldn't be here because the townspeople consider us the enemy. And somewhere along the way, one hand didn't know what the other hand was doing, as unfortunately is still the case on a lot of UN operations. And a company of the 35th Battalion, Common and Quinlan's men, were sent out. Now, when they arrived, it would have been very easy for them to be very passive. They were given an area to be billeted in outside the town. And had Quinlan wanted to be a passenger type of commanding officer, he could have just said to the men, make yourselves comfortable, we're only going to be here a short while, and we're going to pull out of here when this gets straightened out, when I have a word with headquarters. But he was a taciturn and very methodical type of officer. And he ordered his subordinate officers and senior NCOs to prepare the men to dig in, which is a particular military formation. John may remember it from his own training. Company in defence. It's not like trenches, not like World War I, but little 2 to 3 man fighting trenches. And what that means is that you have, if you sight them properly, you have interlocking fields of fire. And it's that interlocking of the fields of fire that provides an actual barrier of lead against your adversary with all-round defence. So you sight your platoons as part of your company with all-round defence, you ensure that there's interlocking fields of fire, and you use your support weapons appropriately, as in the heavy machine guns and the mortars, most of which they didn't have, by the way. They had to kind of do a loaves and fishes. So, in essence, the men were there to protect civilians. It was a kind of, on paper, a Srebrenica situation, for those of you who have studied the Balkans War, where, unfortunately, the outcome was, or rather, fortunately, the outcome was much better than Srebrenica. And people talk about Quinlan's great feat in bringing all his men home safely. And yes, it was a great feat. But I want to say this because it hasn't been said enough. He didn't do it at the expense of his mission, as did happen later in other locations and jurisdictions. He didn't, he didn't order his men to lay down their arms so that, other people ended up being massacred. There was no issue about that. He didn't order his men to lay down their arms so that their position could be taken and the overall strategy of the force he was part of, the UN force, would be corrupted or stymied. He only ordered his men to lay down their arms when they barely had the means to continue defending themselves, and there was no longer an objective to be defended. And probably also, he realised that it was futile to continue bloodshed from either end, because at this stage, while there were quite a few wounded, there weren't any Irish killed, but there were quite a few dead bodies on the other side.
Just give us those numbers, John, because they're extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminded me, to all intents and purposes, of another film, the film Zulu, which I'm sure that comparison has been drawn before. We all remember the tribe coming and laying their arms down and recognising the great heroism of the men who were defending that particular fort in that film. But the numbers involved in JADOTVILLE are extraordinary.
They are, and again, a number of people, particularly military professionals from particularly other jurisdictions, have said, "Look, this is exaggerated. There's no way that could happen." And they're right in one sense. They're right to question it, because with the kind of munitions that were being employed, at one stage they were being strafed by a jet, not a particularly well-designed jet for that, a Fuga jet, but hey. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and if I have a jet and you don't, you have a major strategic advantage. They were mortared, they were shelled, and they had minimal resources. They had 60mm mortars that they used to great effect. But they accounted for approximately 300 enemy KIA, killed in action. And that figure is arrived at from two sources, as far as I'm aware. The Ministry of the Interior, Godfrey Monungo, who in the latter stages ended up being the one to negotiate with Commandant Pat Quinlan for the ceasefire and then surrender, alluded to the fact that they had killed approximately that amount. And also, when A Company were initially in captivity, they saw coffins being transported and stopping at the area where they were held for the Katangan flag. And the only ones who merited a coffin and a proper funeral were the mercenary officers. So based on how many coffins they saw, and based on your lieutenant or captain, a lieutenant would command a platoon of 30-odd men. So Quinlan was able to extrapolate from that roughly, and to balance out the figures. And again, not to denigrate anybody or to take from anybody's achievements or whatever, in the initial phase of action, it was approximately 1,500 that were ranged against A Company. A Company was 150-odd men with attachments, 157. And the initial figure of the Katangan Gendarmerie was 1,500, and it grew. But what we should remember is that while it was mercenary-led and officered, and you had a bunch of redundant former French foreign legionnaires, highly experienced NCOs with crew-served weapons, the artillery pieces and various other things, the mainstream soldiery were indigenous population. They were Katangans. And while they were well armed with FN rifles, they didn't have much time to train them. And it's questioned about how much sense of commitment they would have had. They were not conscripted, but they would have been pressed into service rather hurriedly. Now, picture that if you can. I don't know whether you've seen the film or not. But actually, to be fair to the film, I think it does give a good representation. It was a kind of a ragtag enough bunch. Superior numbers with some very committed, experienced, combat-hardened officers and NCOs. But there was a disparity that you wouldn't have in a properly constituted military like either the Irish or the British or another European or US force. And the benefit or the advantage that A Company had, well, they lacked in numbers, they lacked in munitions and weapons, but they were a cohesive, tightly bound force. They had been training not in a very sophisticated way. Peacekeeping was new. Nobody knew what this was about, but they knew the basics and they knew how to do them well, and they trusted their officers and NCOs.
And what Declan has described there really well is actually the field of operations. What was happening there in that spot with this large army coming towards, or this large group of extras, I suppose they would be in a film, coming towards this group of highly trained, or more highly trained men, or maybe trained men, than that other army was. So you're talking very much about what's happening there. A lot of what the book deals with is what was happening elsewhere, and that will bring me back to John now, because, in Crime of Passion, we're dealing with Daniel and his making this film, and, in the field of operations, getting down and doing the business. But in fact, it's not what's happening in the making of a film on set that is causing him real problems. It's all the machinery and all the guys behind the scenes that are actually where the real problems lie. In particular, a guy called Harold Witt. Explain his role in the novel. In particular, I'm thinking of a scene. It's around about page 144. Bella, who's the wife of the producer, she's making a kind of a making-of documentary about the film that's been made. She goes into a meeting with him, and he kind of explains, listen to me now, here's the reality about filmmaking.
Well, he's the head of distribution in one of the major studios. And so what happens in the course of the story, in the course of trying to make this film, it takes them to the Cannes Film Festival, it takes them to Hollywood, where he's pitched it, tries to get support, and so forth. And Bella makes interviews, because she interviews this head of distribution.
Bella is the producer's wife.
And she wants to find out how it's done. And he goes on to explain it, and he points out that the distribution and marketing tail has for a long time been wagging the production dog, if you like. And more and more, Hollywood filmmaking is about the marketing. And the way they market films is basically with massive 30-second TV ads. And often the advertising budget is greater than the budget for making a film. So I've often been in a situation where I'm pitching a story to the head of a studio, and he says to me, okay, it sounds interesting, but what's the TV ad? Now, of course, the point is that if you have a movie star holding a gun, the audience can get that in 30 seconds. Anything that is original is, by definition, much more difficult to explain because people haven't seen anything like this before. So originality becomes the enemy, and that's why sequels and remakes are so prevalent. And this is what she learns from this man, and he describes a movie that they've made, and he's looked at it and he realizes it's a dog. So what he does is he decides to put it out with heavy advertising, 4,000 prints, and try to get his money back on the first weekend before people realize how bad it is. And this is a strategy. You see, it used to be that in Hollywood that a picture would open in 1, 2, 3 prints in New York, Los Angeles, maybe Chicago, and they would sit there and gather an audience and then gradually move out across the country. And that's completely disappeared. And now they go out with massive advertising and 4, 5, 6,000 prints. So a film like 2001, which...
Yeah, Bella actually tells this story
yes.
about, how she explains how 2001: A Space Odyssey How many prints were there of it initially?
Two. It opened. I saw it on the opening day at the Cinerama Dome in Los Angeles, and it opened in New York at the same time. And the reviews were not good, and nor was the business. This was a highly original film, and when I saw it, I immediately phoned Kubrick because I recognised that it was an outstanding landmark movie, and to congratulate him. And a week later, he called me because he didn't have enough good reviews for what we call a review ad, where you quote the reviews. So he contacted me and some other directors who admired it and got quotes from us, and that was his review ad. It was quoted me. And now that film stayed in there, and it gradually gathered an audience. Gradually word went round, and it built up and became a huge hit, as well as a great film. And had it opened under the present system, it would have failed in the first weekend and would have disappeared. We'd never heard of it again. So that's a measure of the industrialization of the film industry, which is, in a sense, destroying itself. And I think that's what this character Bella experiences with this man, who is trying to hold on to the system, hanging on, as they all are. And you have also in the story an agent who is based on an agent that I once had, who had this great air of sincerity. It was almost real, and he would never commit himself to a film. He would never commit himself, so that he could never be wrong. So that he had certain pieties that he would say, it's everything you wanted it to be. Or it's all up there on the screen. Or every frame is that as it should be, or would be, or something. So that's, and the same with the studio executives. The ones who survive are the ones who never give a green light to a picture, because once they do, they're committed to it, and if it fails, the failure attaches itself to them. So
it reminds me, actually, when you say that, of in a former life, when I used to tread the boards, there was an actor who would come to see plays, and he 99 times out of 100 afterwards would say, very brave choices. Which is totally non-committal in the same way. But it's interesting that you have mentioned 2001 and your own experience there. You've mentioned The Agent and your own experience there. And this brings me to the first part of my introduction and how close fact and fiction might be. Why did you choose to tell this particular story as a work of fiction? Never mind the fact that you're a filmmaker and you've written a novel. Why a work of fiction?
Because so much of what affects the film is the emotions of the people making it and their relationships. And that's because it's such an emotional business. It's all about emotions, really, and how they're governed or ungoverned. And the making of a film is a hothouse where emotions are magnified. And so I wanted to show how those emotions affect a film and how they take it over and alter it and change it. And it could only be done in the course of a fiction, a story, a fiction. And although it is fiction, the story is full of actual people, movie stars, and
You're in it yourself?
I'm in it too, yes.
Did you have qualms about putting yourself in there?
No, I wanted to put myself in there because I wanted to disassociate myself
From the author.
for the character. For the character of Daniel Shaw, the director.
All right, yes.
So,
There would be, that Daniel
clear
would be a
it
version
wasn't
of you. Yeah.
And so that was my motive anyway, that's making it this way.
Going back to what John said earlier, Declan, about the marketing tail wagging the artistic dog, that was something I wanted to pick up on, and again, I think we're parallels in the JADOTVILLE story. I don't know what the equivalent tail, maybe it's the political tail wagging the military dog, I don't know. But the role of Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the General Secretary of the UN,
Correct.
and later killed, in fact,
Yeah.
in the Congo, and our own,
The cruiser.
yeah, I'm going to say, some people might say beloved, some
Yeah.
people mightn't say beloved, Conor Cruise O'Brien. What were their roles? In fact, Conor Cruise O'Brien might have been a tail being wagged by somebody else, was he?
Well, it depends on your perspective. And it's an interesting question to ask, what were their roles? I think you could write an entire book, maybe a few volumes, about that period and the role of Hammarskjöld, the role of Cruise O'Brien. There was a book written by an English lady, Susan Smith, called Who Killed Hammarskjöld, which looks into it. I've heard variations on that, but the thing, you can't write about an incident in the Congo without trying to put some of that context on it. However, on the other hand, from my point of view, when I first tried to put this together, nobody would have been too interested in Declan Power's take on Hammarskjöld or Cruise O'Brien. And nobody would have been too interested in the story about JADOTVILLE either. I was lucky in one sense, because it was 11 years ago when I first wrote the book, that Maverick House and Johnny Mooney took an interest in it and had a kind of an ear. We discussed a couple of different topics, and he said, is this true? And I said, it is. He said, like, really? Like, did it happen like that? And I said, it did. And we discussed about how we were going to put it together, because
The original book in 2005.
the original book, on the basis that it was still very, very politically divisive within Ireland. People fell into two categories within the army. You were a Quinlan man, or you were, maybe supportive of the battalion commander. And standing back, because I was a different generation, I realised that this was never going to, if the book was going to be helpful in shedding light on what I believed was an important episode of our contemporary history, it couldn't be about which side you were on within an Irish or an army context, or you wouldn't get the political support. I felt it was about getting it so that politicians could stand up and say, yeah, it's time we looked at this again, or it's time we not so much exonerated these men, because nobody had actually publicly vilified them, but just gave them their place in the sun. And so that dictated how I was writing that. I didn't want to go down rabbit holes. I felt the story of the battle itself was succinct enough. But going back to your point, Conor Cruise O'Brien's role in it, obviously, I have to say, in fairness to Richie Smith, the director of the film, when he came to me and he said he wanted to adapt the book.
How long after just that there was a delay, but the publication of the book initially 2005.
Yeah.
When did the talk about a possible film version, when did that come about?
There was a nephew of Jim Sheridan, actually, John Sheridan, approached and optioned the book about 2 years after that, but couldn't raise the finance, which is interesting too, because it shows you that everybody is kind of excited about it now, or says, what a great story, the hidden story. It wasn't so much that it was just covered up with political intent. A lot of people didn't give a stuff about it. John Sheridan couldn't get money within this country. A bunch of Irish soldiers, so what? Who cares? Maybe I'm being a bit blasé in the way of saying it, but that's exactly what he got, and he was making sound efforts, and I wasn't expecting anything to come of it. I would about my business, and I was in Africa, Darfur, 2009, working, actually, when I got this email, sorting through emails to do with a kidnapping. And, bit of real drama going on. And then there's this guy saying, I'd like to have a chat with you some one of the days about your book, and we see, I'm interested in turning it into a film. And I kind of looked at it again. Now, I was due home in about 6 weeks, and that's when I met Richie. We met, had a pint and discussed. And I kind of, he was telling me about his ideas, and I was thinking, yeah, right, And the only one concern I had was, will this fella get it? will he get the story? And at one point he said to me, you could take this to Hollywood. Now, he was doing a little bit of ego stroking here. You could take this to Hollywood, and they'd snap it up and you'd get a great deal. But he said, by the time they'd be finished, it would be US troops in somewhere else, and the whole story.
Probably, right?
So in other words, you sign up with me and I look after the story. But to be fair to the guy, he took a personal interest in it. And while he made a film, as he said, it's not going to be a documentary, and I totally understood what he was getting at. He did stay true to the essential element. He told the essence of the story. He dramatised certain things, and I would argue, not to sound either pious about it or patronising, but to people who have never been in a theatre of operations or who will never hear a few rounds whistle over their head or very close to them, he wanted to try and put you there. And so where he dramatised certain things like the helicopter landing. The helicopter did come in, did land, did get shot up. Two brave men risked their lives to help it land by putting out panels to show where the even ground was. But Richard made it even more dramatic to show you the pressures they were under.
There's another scene then, can I check if this is, I can't remember whether it's in the book or not. There's a scene where the Quinlan, they're practically out of ammunition at this stage, and effectively he sees the empty shells. Yeah. And this all happens in the space of whatever, 2.5 minutes in the film. Yeah. He sees the empty shells, ping, the light bulb goes off in his head. 10 minutes later, there's a fellow running across with a fuse wire. They've put all these empty shells in to basically make a nail bomb. Yeah. And that's how they deal with the next wave of an attack. How real is that?
Okay. Most of you have probably seen the film Michael Collins. You remember the debate about what car bomb went off. There were no car bombs in those days. Maybe that's a little bit of the car bomb element. What did happen, and what that is based on, is that Quinlan had the nous to realise that he couldn't keep defending his area as they were running low on ammunition because it was too broad, too wide. And under cover of night, he had the men prepare additional trenches closer and to the rear of the Perfina garage, so that at a certain point when they were coming under severe pressure militarily, under cover of night, he had the men withdraw from their outer positions into a much tighter position that they had all round defence of, and that they were able to conserve their ammunition. And the essence of good defence is directed fire, that the officers and NCOs, you don't just decide to I'll have a burst over here, and John will, sure, maybe he'll bag a few coming, that you kind of get that impression from cowboy films. And I think the film shows that. The NCOs are very important in this role, in that they give the fire orders to their men. So, at your target in front, 300 yards, 10 rounds fire. And there would have been a lot of that kind of thing.
That's specific.
Bursts. That's specific. Bushy top tree, left off 300 rounds, Bren gun 20 rounds. Now, obviously, as it gets tighter and they're coming in, each man has to make his own decisions. But if you're getting good directed fire, you're keeping them at bay. And that's what it was all about. So when they pulled in tighter, they were getting in closer. It mightn't have looked quite as dramatic, but I guarantee you, if you were there, if you were the one looking at this superior force, which is now swelling to 3,000, and you're running low on ammo, it was bloody dramatic.
Which brings me to the point of, you have written in the book, you've written a history, a work of non-fiction. With the appendices at the back, you have the sources at the back, you give us, you catalogue exactly what each rank means in the army. It's a factual work in as much as you can, in as much as anybody can state facts on a page. That's another 3 weeks of argument whether facts exist or not. What was your feeling about, because I said in my introduction that in some ways what we see on the film it sits easily in any work of fiction. Yeah. And I could see it in Hollywood, absolutely. I agree with Richie on that. They could have done it. It would have been an American guy, and they would have done all those things, and the American flag would have been up at the end. Don't know what president would have been there at the time, but that's another night's work as well.
Another day's work.
What was your feeling about a work of history, a work of non-fiction, becoming this dramatised thing?
Yeah. Well, now, the answer to that lies in something John said earlier, when he talked about, emotions, personalities, and all of this confluence of things, how your objective when you start a film can be something quite different at the end of it. And even in the military, it resonated with me. They always say, no plan survives contact with the enemy, that you start with a plan. And it is, when you have a plan, more than in filmmaking, you can tweak it and you can adjust. You've got something tangible to adjust. When I was in the process of going from the researching to the writing of the book, my objective changed as well. I initially wanted to write something that was straight down the middle, very factual and very kind of terse, and military. I reckon I was aiming at a fairly small audience. I didn't see it as being a populist work. I wanted it to be a factual, authoritative thing that would set the record straight. As I went along, I could see the story of the battle, the accounts from the men, at different levels and different ranks. I thought it deserved a little bit more treatment to make it more visceral. So, with the permission of Walter Hegarty, Sergeant Walter Hegarty, DSM, he won the Distinguished Service Medal later in the Battle of the Tunnel. He'd kept diaries. That's great. They were contemporaneous notes, not so much about the plans or whatever else, but about his own feelings and about the men. And of all the guys I spoke to, he was able to give me kind of a colourful kind of exposition. And if you've seen the film, there's a character with glasses in it. That's Walter, and he, pretty much he was nearly killed in a mortar blast. So, with Walter's permission, I said to him, "I'd like to try something here. I'd like to try and put some things into your words, and to try and write a couple of chapters where I didn't fictionalise it. It was all based on what he had told me, what was in his diaries, but I kind of put a narrative to it. And then I had another idea. I was reading Commandant Quinlan's reports extensively, and I decided then, rather than starting off in a very strict timeline, I'd start off immediately after the action, where, and this is true, where he walks into the bar and filled with mercenaries. They have a ceasefire, because unlike what's shown in the film, because of time, Quinlan was asked for a ceasefire towards the very end because he had left them in a jocker. Had he been maybe better informed by headquarters, had they been engaged in better intelligence gathering, he might have actually have been able to break the back of their attack, because the morale was so low with the mercenary-led forces, with the natives were turning and running, and in some cases being shot out of hand by the mercenary officers to stop a rout. But he agreed to a ceasefire. There was joint patrolling. He goes into town. So there was a period of a week or more of this hiatus before he was outmanoeuvred politically, and he was left to his own devices anyway. He was a commandant, equivalent of a major, dealing with the Ministry of the Interior, Godfrey Munungo, in this negotiation phase. But he goes into this bar to buy beer for his men because the water had been turned off. There was no water supplies. There were no water supplies in the area the Irish were dug in. And all these mercenaries come to attention. And you're reading it in his own handwriting, the initial report. And they called him Le Major Irlandais, which I always thought was curious. If it had been left to me, they have the rank commandant of the French army, and they have a rank major, which is a kind of a senior NCO rank. Why they were calling him that, I'm not sure. But he had a certain bearing. He was a tall, lean, soldierly man with a moustache, and he had a craggy kind of countenance, and he carried himself a certain way with a certain amount of moral authority. And they parted. And he went up to the bar and he ordered, and guys then started coming up to him and showing them their wounds. And they were looking at him as a worthy adversary. You mentioned Zulu. It was a little bit of a Zulu moment, but it actually happened, where they were saying, we've been in combat with you for the last 4 or 5 days. We've lost men. We've been wounded. You've lost guys. We respect you. Like at one point when he walked into the bar, and he had one Swedish officer with him, the co-pilot of the helicopter, Eric Tors. They called the room to attention. That was their measure of respect. And on the way out, he was asked, "And how many men did you lose?" And he says, "None." And there was silence. They were shocked. He put his beret on his head and he marched off out into the night before they started to get maudlin about the fact that we've lost X amount of men, and these bloody paddies, they've lost none. But they didn't believe him. Like there were reports in the newspapers based on reports coming back from the Fuga jet pilot, about 20% or more casualties, because the pilot was seeing bedrolls that were out behind the trenches. The trenches, again...
What's a bed, sorry, mate?
Bed, like a sleeping bag, that each infantryman would have for bedding down on the side of the road if needs be. And again, some of you may be aware that the jet pilot, as he was flying in at different points and times, initially he flew quite low and he could see a lot of things. And he was reporting back about these bedrolls. He couldn't see too much, because unlike the way the trenches are shown in the film, they have to be shown in a more open, shallow way, so you can see the faces of the actors. And that's also why they're not wearing helmets, and they refer to the fact that they were fiberglass and not worth a damn. But the real trenches, if you look at any of the photographs that are available online or in the book, they're well dug in. They've little overhead cover, which use whatever you can find, wood or a bit of corrugated, and you put some topsod over it. Now that's crucial, because when there are bomb bursts, when there's shrapnel, and when they were being strafed, that meant the men that saved their lives. Now, you wouldn't have seen too much of them when the jet pilot would have been flying in, but he saw